500 years ago, England was an afterthought on the edge of Europe. Its population? Barely 3 million. Compare that to China with 200 million or India with 100 million. England was a cold, damp island with poor farmland, no vast deposits of gold or silver, and hardly any sunshine. And yet, by the dawn of the 20th century, this same island ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. The British Crown controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land and a third of its population. The sun literally never set on its colonies. English became the dominant world language, its navy ruled the oceans, and for centuries, Britain acted as the undisputed predator of the planet. But here's the burning question. How did such a small, relatively weak country transform itself into the world's apex predator? To understand, we have to look back at one unlikely source: Venice. In the Middle Ages, this small city, built on the lagoons of Italy, wasn't just famous for gondolas. Protected by water, insulated from constant warfare, and enriched by trade routes, Venice became one of the wealthiest hubs of Europe. By the late 13th century, Venetian merchants were so powerful that in 1204 they helped sack Constantinople itself, looting the Byzantine capital and seizing vast wealth. At its peak, Venice was governed by just 40 aristocratic families, controlling unimaginable amounts of money and influence. From their ranks came popes, financiers, and dynasties that shaped the modern West. But by the 16th century, Venice faced an existential problem. European powers united against it, threatening its dominance. Its elite families needed a new safe haven to protect their capital and expand into the Atlantic economy. And so, like chess players shifting pieces, they turned their eyes toward England. England at the time lagged behind its continental rivals. Spain dominated the Americas, France had a larger population and economy, the Netherlands ruled the seas. England, meanwhile, was politically unstable and economically mediocre. But it had one advantage: location. Perched at the edge of the Atlantic, it was perfectly positioned to jump into the booming transoceanic trade. For Venetian bankers, England was the ideal vault. They could pour their money and know-how into shaping a small island into the next imperial hub. And that's exactly what they did. Venetian capitalists and exiles began influencing English education, finance, and even espionage. They helped establish institutions like Trinity College at Cambridge, which produced generations of leaders, aristocrats, and financiers. They lent their expertise in trade networks, banking systems, and intelligence operations, skills honed over centuries in the Mediterranean. England didn't become a superpower because of its farmland or climate. It became a superpower because it became the new fortress of Venetian wealth and knowledge. At the same time, England's own society was mutating. The brutal civil wars of the 15th century had decimated its old nobility. To fill the gap, wealthy farmers were granted aristocratic titles, creating a new land-owning class, the gentry. These weren't refined nobles. They were pragmatic, often ruthless businessmen obsessed with land, money, and power. And when you mix this class with pirate adventurers, failed European exiles, and the Venetian financial elite, you get a potent recipe: a society willing to steal, plunder, and kill in the name of profit. This was the birth of Britain's predator culture, one that would shape the next 4 centuries. To understand the rise of Britain, you have to accept one uncomfortable fact. It was built on theft. England's early rulers knew they couldn't compete with Spain's colonies, France's armies, or the Dutch fleets by playing fair, and so they embraced piracy as official policy. Take Sir Francis Drake. Officially, he was a privateer, when in reality, he was a government-sponsored pirate. His raids across the Spanish Main in the late 1500s brought home gold and silver so vast that one voyage alone netted enough to pay off England's national debt. Queen Elizabeth herself pocketed the profits. Piracy wasn't the exception, it was the system. The Crown would license marauders to loot Catholic rivals, destroy trade ships, and funnel stolen wealth back into the royal treasury. That money built England's navy, funded their wars, and gave the Crown the resources it needed to transform the nation into a maritime powerhouse. But the plunder did not stop at sea. On the home front, England engineered its first great act of Brexit, a break from Rome. When Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church, it wasn't only about marriage, it was also about wealth. Overnight, the crown seized church lands, gold, and property. Monasteries were looted, treasures melted down, and England's rulers suddenly controlled vast new resources. That break gave England both political independence and an economic windfall, fueling its new imperial ambitions. England's predatory instincts did not spare its own citizens. The crown and landowning gentry pushed peasants off their lands in what historians would call an enclosure movement. Farms were turned into sheep pastures to feed the booming wool trade, while displaced peasants were left destitute. Tens of thousands were executed for petty crimes or simply for being vagrants. This was a society that perfected the art of exploitation at home before exporting it abroad. And by the 18th century, Britain's appetite had grown global. No target proved to be more profitable than India. Through the East India Company, the world's first true multinational corporation, Britain transformed India into a cash cow. Taxes were collected at gunpoint, then used to buy Indian goods, which were shipped off to England virtually for free. One economist has calculated the true scale of this extraction. Britain drained the equivalent of $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938, 15 times the size of Britain's own economy today. While London streets were full of marble, stone, and wealth, millions of Indians starved, and in 1911 life expectancy in India was just 22 years old. Empire wasn't about civilization. It was about extraction on an industrial scale. And when India wasn't enough, Britain then turned to China. Using India as a base, British merchants flooded China with opium, addicting millions. And when the Chinese government resisted, Britain simply responded with the infamous Opium Wars. And the outcome, China was forced to open its ports, hand over Hong Kong, and allow Britain to continue its narcotics trade. Britain wasn't only about trading goods, though. It was also about waging economic warfare that was backed by cannon fire until entire nations would collapse. Piracy and colonies alone could not build the empire, though. There was one invention that would give Britain an unstoppable advantage: the printing press for money. By the late 1600s, constant wars had bankrupted the crown, and then came a new class of financiers, many with Venetian and Dutch roots. In 1694, they struck a deal with the monarchy. In exchange for lending money to the government, they would be allowed to establish a private institution to issue paper money on behalf of the state. It would be called the Bank of England. On the surface, it sounded harmless. Paper notes could be exchanged for gold and silver, when in reality, it was a financial revolution. The crown could now fund endless wars and expansion simply by issuing debt. Bankers would earn interest, the monarchy gained power, and England unlocked a magic trick that other nations had not yet mastered: creating wealth out of nothing. From this moment forward, Britain wasn't only fighting with cannons, it was fighting with credit. By the 18th century, Britain had more than ships and bankers. It had something far more dangerous: networks of influence that stretched across borders, quietly shaping the politics of entire nations. In London during the early 1700s, a movement would emerge that blended philosophy, fraternity, and power. It was called Freemasonry. On the surface, it looked like a gentleman's society for intellectual discussion, but its real impact would be staggering. Freemasons built a transnational web that linked politicians, generals, bankers, and aristocrats across Europe and the Americas. They preached values like liberty, equality, fraternity, when in practice, they were providing elites with a safe and discreet network to coordinate political action. The American Revolution? Many of the founding fathers were Freemasons. The French Revolution? Its leaders openly borrowed Masonic slogans and symbols. Even in Russia, during the 1917 revolutions, a shocking number of provisional government figures were Masons. Freemasonry wasn't demonic or magical. It was actually practical, the first truly global social network for the elite, and Britain was at its epicenter. This network would carry with it a very specific worldview. While Spain cloaked its empire in Catholicism and France promoted royal power, Britain sold an ideology: liberalism. But there is a twist. Britain rarely applied this liberalism at home. Its monarchy stayed intact, its traditions remained rigid, and instead, freedom and republicanism were exported as tools of destabilization abroad. If a rival monarchy looked too strong, Masonic lodges would agitate for revolution. If a colony became restless, Britain would whisper promises of liberty, only to replace old rulers with new elites that were loyal to London. This dual strategy, tradition at home, revolution abroad, allowed Britain to play both sides of history, and alongside its financial and political tools, it cultivated an ideology of racial superiority. By the 19th century, British thinkers openly described Anglo-Saxons as a chosen race, destined to rule the planet. This wasn't fringe rhetoric, though. It was mainstream imperial propaganda, justified conquest, slavery, and the subjugation of entire continents. Later, German racial theorists would borrow heavily from these British ideas. What set Britain apart from other colonial powers became its ability to survive even after losing territory. When its colonies would rebel, like America, Britain maintained influence through finance, trade, and secret societies. Consider the City of London, a tiny square mile inside the capital. For centuries it operated like a state within a state. Monarchs had to surrender their weapons to enter, and today it remains the beating heart of global finance, processing trillions while laundering much of the world's dirty money. This is the secret of Britain's empire. It was never only about land. It was about systems, those of finance, ideology, and networks that would transcend borders. As the centuries rolled on, Britain's shadow institutions evolved. The 19th century would give birth to elite circles like Cecil Rhodes's secret society, which dreamed of Anglo-Saxon global dominance. The 20th century produced gatherings like the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, networks that would blur the lines between government and private power. Each of these became an update of the same idea, that true power should be wielded not through parliaments or kings, but through elite clubs that quietly steer the course of nations. By the 1800s, Britain wasn't just an empire, it was a machine, a predator disguised as a gentleman. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain had perfected something no other empire had: the art of survival. While Spain had lost its colonies and France stumbled through revolutions, Britain built systems that could outlive the flag. The key became financial. With the Bank of England, Britain pioneered the modern central banking model, issuing paper money not backed by gold, but by debt. This alchemy would allow Britain to fund wars, colonize territories, while maintaining naval supremacy without draining the royal treasury. By the 1800s, Britain's financial system became so powerful that wars were won not only on the battlefield, but in counting houses. Credit became a weapon as potent as gunpowder. And when Nathan Rothschild and his dynasty rose to prominence in London, the fusion of private banking and state power would reach a level unseen in history. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Rothschild's influence over government debt made them central players in Britain's rise as the world's financial hub. Even when the Bank of England was formally nationalized in 1946, its independence from direct political control remained intact. The machine just kept on running. But what about the colonies? On the surface, the British Empire had collapsed after World War II. India gained its independence. African nations broke free, and Britain's military dominance waned. But the system, it didn't disappear. It simply adapted. The City of London reinvented itself as the world's offshore capital, and today an estimated 40% of the world's dirty money flows through its networks of banks, tax havens, and shell companies. Former colonies like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the Channel Islands became satellite vaults, safe havens for the wealth of the global elite. The British Empire had stopped being visible and became financial. And ideology? Britain's export of liberalism, the promise of freedom and democracy, continued long after the empire's flags came down. America, built in part by British Masonic ideals, had become the news stage for this export. The rhetoric of liberty and rights, once used by Britain to destabilize its rivals, now lived on in Washington, London's successor and ally. But the hidden logic remains the same. Talk of freedom, while real power stayed concentrated in the hands of elites. So then, what is Britain's true legacy? Not just colonies, railroads, or English as a global language. The true legacy is a system. Organizational power, secret societies, and elite clubs that blur borders and manipulate nations. Financial power, like central banking, debt, and offshore networks that made money itself a weapon. And ideological power, the belief that one chosen people had the right to rule while others were expendable. This system created an empire that was less about territory and more about control, one that could retreat from maps while remaining embedded in global institutions. And so, when we speak of Britain's decline, we have to be careful. The Union Jack may no longer fly over a quarter of the earth, but the empire never truly died. It simply changed its shape. From visible colonies to invisible networks. From India's drained wealth to China's forced opium addiction. From the Bank of England's first notes to the trillions passing through the city today. Britain's story is not only about history, it's the foundation of our modern world. Because the greatest trick the British Empire ever pulled was convincing us that it ended. If this story sparked your interest, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss another great video like this one. There's much more fascinating content coming soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.